All right, the court is going to call Dr. Marshall to the stand. Dr. Marshall, if you'll please approach. Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
Will you please raise your right hand? I'll wait till the interpreters are in place. In one moment. Apologize. Please raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm, under penalty of perjury, that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth?
I do.
Thank you. Please be seated.
May I proceed, Your Honor?
Yes, please do.
Dr. Marshall, would you please state your full name for the record?
Dr. Pablo Marshall.
And what is your present address?
I live at 918 West 10th Street in Denver, Colorado, 80230.
And what is your profession?
I am a clinical psychologist.
Do you have a license to practice as a clinical psychologist?
Yes, I do.
And when did you receive that license?
In 1990.
Did you have to take an examination to get that license?
Yes, I did.
And would you describe to the court, please, what type of examination you had to take?
The examination is written and oral, and it's administered by the state.
And so are you licensed in the state of Colorado?
Yes, I am, as well in the state of Illinois.
And where did you receive your education, doctor?
I received my doctorate in psychology from the University of Illinois in 1988. I also received a master's degree from that same institution in 1986 and a bachelor's degree in psychology from Northwestern University. I also have a certificate of training in clinical psychology from the Menninger Foundation, which I received in 1989.
Do you belong to any professional organizations?
I do. I belong to the American Psychological Association, and I am a fellow of that organization.
What about teaching? Have you taught at any institutions?
Yes, I have. I have taught at the Menninger Foundation and at the Menninger School of Psychiatry, and I currently teach at the University of Colorado in Denver.
Are you affiliated with any hospitals?
Yes, I am. I practice at 3 hospitals in the Denver and Boulder communities.
Are you board certified in any specialty?
Yes, I am. I am a diplomat of the American Board of Professional Psychology.
And can you please describe to the court what exactly that means?
Yes. This is a national certifying board. One gets certified after a number of years of practice, following a written and oral examination, as well as work samples.
Doctor, have you published any writings?
Yes, I have.
Can you describe those to the court?
I have published in scientific journals in the area of psychology. Some articles early in my career are in the area of parent-child relationships.
Approximately how many articles have you published altogether?
Oh, I would say about 15 or 20.
Okay, over and above what you've just described to the court, do you have any special qualifications as an expert in child custody cases?
Well, in training at the Menninger Foundation, I was trained in both adult and child psychology. I have taken particular interest in deaf children. I have actively counseled deaf children for nearly 7 years now. In fact, one of the articles that I authored dealt with the pressure placed on a deaf child, who has hearing parents.
Have you ever testified as an expert witness before?
Yes, I have.
Approximately how many times?
Well, many times over the course of my 20-plus years of practice.
Your Honor, I would offer Dr. Marshall as an expert witness in this matter and subject, of course, to any cross-examination.
All right, thank you. Ms. Smith, do you have any voir dire or cross-examination for this witness?
No, I don't.
All right, thank you. Please proceed, Ms. Smith.
Thank you.
And I apologize. I will accept this witness as an expert in the field of psychology. Go ahead.
Thank you, Your Honor. Doctor, did you have an occasion to examine the 3 members of the Richards family?
Yes, I did.
How did you become involved in this matter?
Well, as I understand it, the parties to this proceeding agreed to undergo psychiatric evaluation. Dr. Melanie Bishop, a psychiatrist here in Denver, referred them to me. She's an old friend and knew of my work with deaf individuals.
And so, did you conduct an examination?
Yes, I did.
And as a result of that examination, did you prepare a report?
Yes, I prepared 2 reports, one which covers the examination material on the parents, the other one covering the child.
And are copies of those reports here in court?
Yes, they are.
Judge, I'd ask the record to indicate that the court has a copy of each report and that I have a copy of each report and that my other counsel also has a copy of each report.
Okay, that's correct. I do have copies of those reports. And Ms. Brown, I assume you have your copies as well. Is that correct?
That's correct, Your Honor.
Okay.
Judge, may I approach and so we can mark these reports as exhibits?
Yes, please do.
I'm handing to the court 2 reports. I'd ask they be marked as exhibits 1 and 2.
All right, these 2 exhibits will be marked as exhibits 1 and 2. Number 1 will be the report regarding the parents, and number 2 will be the report regarding the child.
And Judge, for the purposes of this next testimony, I'd ask that Dr. Marshall be allowed to refer to his notes in order to report accurately to the court.
That would be fine. Please feel free to refer to your report.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you, Judge. Doctor, referring to exhibit number 1, would you please tell the court what examinations you conducted and what your findings were?
Yes, I examined Mr. Richards on January 27th and 28th, and Miss Richards on January 30th and 31st. I administered the same battery of tests to each of the parties. The battery of tests include the following: the Draw a Picture test, the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, the story recall test, the Bender Gestalt, the Rorschach test, the thematic apperception test, the word association test, the concept sorting test, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, also known as the MMPI, the sentence completion test, and finally, I interviewed the parties with an interpreter during the examination and between the various testing. I should note that certified interpreters were available at all times, provided by Purple Communications, a local interpreter agency.
Thank you, Doctor. I would direct your attention back to the first test that you administered, which you testified to. What was the name of that test?
Yes, it is called the Draw a Person test.
Tell us what kind of test that is, why you administered it, and what information it's supposed to give back to you.
The Draw a Person test is a test where you ask the person to reproduce a human figure. After they do one human figure, you then ask them to reproduce a second figure different from the first with regard to sex. The test is not an artistic test to test artistic ability, but rather to test or measure one's perception of people, how they are able to reproduce people, and how much detail they can provide in those reproductions. It is also helpful in determining as to whether or not there are any kinds of sexual difficulties present in the person's personality makeup, particularly with regard to details that are provided in one drawing as opposed to the other.
With reference to that specific test, can you tell the court what your findings were as to both of the parties here?
There were no major difficulties for either of the parties with regard to this particular test. As expected, Mr. Richards drew, well, as expected, Mr. Richards drew a man first and a woman second. He provided greater detail in his drawing of the man. With Miss Richards, she drew a woman first, provided more detail to the woman than she did to the man, although in her drawing, the figure of the woman was somewhat larger than the figure of the man.
And would that indicate anything in particular?
Well, it is suggestive of possible some difficulties in relationships that Miss Richard has with men. That's a possibility, at least.
And what was the second test you administered?
The second test is called the WAIS, or the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale. It is the standard intellectual evaluation that is widely used across the country to measure intellectual functioning. It is a series of smaller tests designed to measure information, vocabulary, arithmetic skills, comprehension, capacity to manage abstractions, and general verbal skills. The second half of the test, which also deals with verbal skills, were not appropriate in this case, so I did not use them. When I use this test, I'm not particularly interested in a specific number score, but I'm more interested in the range of intellectual abilities and how people approach the tasks that are provided for them to do.
Why aren't the verbal tests appropriate in this case?
Deaf people's language skills are totally different from those of hearing people. The person with hearing loss does not have access to the verbal stimuli, which is responsible for establishing a great amount of a hearing person's verbal skills.
And what were the results of these tests with reference to these two parties?
There were no major results. Both of the parties functioned well, cooperated well, and there were no major differences in their intellectual abilities that were noticed.
And what was the third test you administered?
The third test is the Bender Gestalt. The Bender Gestalt is a series of 9 geometric designs that are presented to the patient on 3 different administrations. First, in a delayed administration, where the person is shown the picture for 5 seconds, the picture is then taken away, and then they are asked to reproduce the picture. The second administration, they are given the entire series of cards and asked to copy the geometric designs. Finally, on the third administration, the parties are asked to reproduce as many of the designs as accurately as they can without the benefit of seeing the designs again. This is a test that is primarily used to determine whether or not an individual suffers from some kind of organic brain syndrome. In the case here, neither of the parties exhibited any difficulties that would indicate such a problem. However, the test is also useful to measure to some extent one's capacity to attend and concentrate. And here I would report that there were some slight differences, and this is particularly on memory administration. Ms. Richards was able to reproduce 6 out of the 9. But of the 6 she did reproduce, they were accurate. On the other hand, Mr. Richards was able to accurately reproduce 9 out of the 9. The suggestion here is that Ms. Richards had some difficulty in concentration and attention, for this particular test.
Now, if one of the parties were more nervous or upset during this period of time when they're taking the test, would that factor in some way?
Certainly, that would make some difference.
Now, following up on Mr. and Mrs. Richards' language skills, although you didn't test for such skills, did you notice any differences in abilities between Ms. Richards and her husband?
Objection, Your Honor. Dr. Marshall has already testified that he did not test for verbal or communication skills because those tests weren't reliable or appropriate for deaf individuals. He's not an expert in language skills for deaf people, so his opinion here is irrelevant speculation.
Response?
Your Honor, Dr. Marshall has testified that he worked extensively with deaf people. He's an expert at judging personalities and the impact of certain skills and deficiencies have on one's personality and specifically one's ability to parent. His testimony is clearly relevant.
Okay. Dr. Marshall, how much exposure have you had to deaf clients?
Your Honor, I spent at least a couple of 100 hours interviewing deaf clients, of course with the aid of an interpreter.
All right. And have you had experience with a wide variety of deaf clients, or have you interviewed the same clients repeatedly?
I have worked with more than 50 deaf clients, Your Honor.
Okay. Ms. Brown, I am going to allow this testimony in. This doctor has extensive experience in dealing with deaf people, certainly more than the court has had, and to that extent, I believe that his testimony will assist the court. Ms. Smith, I would like you to have the doctor describe the factors that affected any specific conclusions he may have reached.
Thank you.
Go right ahead.
Doctor, as a result of your interviews with Mr. and Mrs. Richards, were you able to form any opinion as to their verbal and or communication skills?
Yes, I was.
And what was that opinion?
Well, I concluded that Ms. Richards had superior language skills. Superior not only to her husband, simply an extremely good command of English for a deaf person. Her vocabulary, sentence structure, and understanding of questions was very good. It was better than 90% of my other deaf clients. The fact that she lost her ability to hear at age 12, after having acquired a foundation in speaking, reading, and writing of English, attributes in large part to this command of English. On the other hand, Mr. Richards, who was born deaf, demonstrated verbal and communication skills roughly equivalent to the average deaf person I've come in contact with. I had to rephrase my questions on several occasions.
Now, could that have been the result of the skill of the interpreter involved?
Well, it could have been, but Mr. Richards specified an interpreter who was assigned, someone who I understood worked with him on a regular basis.
What was the next test that you gave?
I noticed that I skipped one, and I would like to go back to that one now, if I may.
Please.
This test is called the story recall test. I administered the test as part of the standard intellectual evaluation. It's a rather simple test where you read a story, in this case through an interpreter, to a person, and you ask them to repeat the story. After you repeat the story, you read the story on one more occasion, you do some other tasks, and then come back to the story and ask them to repeat it again, but without having heard it again, so you get an immediate and delayed measure of memory for meaningful material. Again, in this test, there are 21 possible correct memories. And both of the parties showed relatively good capacity to remember. Once again, Ms. Richards had some difficulty, particularly on the delayed memory, and she did not score as well as Mr. Richards did. However, what she did remember was expressed more completely.
And would that factor influence a mental health expert in any way in terms of custody of the child?
I would not say that factor would influence custody per se. I think the factor I'm pointing to, and the tests are pointing to, I suppose it's a difference in ability to concentrate and attend possibly under the stress of the examination. One begins to see some consistency that we have problems on the story recall. These are not major problems now. We're talking about relatively subtle differences and also some problems on the Bender Gestalt. It's very clear that neither of these parties suffer from any organic brain syndrome. And so we're beginning to get a picture of a woman, at least, who has some difficulties in the longer range kinds of problems that relate to the tension and concentration. Let me state, these are not problems that are of a pathological nature, but more characteristic of personality development.
And what was the next test?
And Your Honor, if the interpreters may just notify, do you mind interpreting? Signing. The witness, I believe, is slowing down for the interpreters. He can proceed as normally. Don't need to speak slowly for the interpreters, but just take some natural pauses at times for us to complete the interpretation.
That's fine. And Dr. Marshall, I do appreciate you trying to slow yourself down for the interpreters, but they are qualified and you can just go ahead and testify as you normally would. If there's a problem or a witness is speaking too fast, or if the court is speaking
We will
too
notify
fast,
the
which
court.
I do at times, please let me know.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
Go right ahead.
And what was the next test?
The next test was the Rorschach test. The Rorschach test is commonly known as a projective personality test. It is a series of 10 ink blot cards widely used in clinical settings. Each of the cards are presented to the patient, and the patient is asked to report and respond as to what they see in each of the cards. Following the patient's response to the card, some inquiry is made to further elucidate how they use the qualities of the card. These cards are both made. Some of the cards are all black, and some also have colors added to the card. And one is interested in how they have used the cards, the content of their responses, how well they used, if color is presented on the card, the color, and how well they integrate their responses overall. There is no correct or incorrect answers per se. And this is not a test that is like a school test in the sense that you can score it and come up with a number score. There are many factors that are scored in this particular test.
Hold on one moment, please.
And what was the result of this test as in reference to these two parties?
Well, this is one of the tests that reflected some differences in the way the parties deal with feelings. Miss Richards is somewhat of an emotional person, an effervescent person, who has some difficulties in dealing with positive and warm feelings and integrating those feelings productively into her life. It's not that she's not sensitive to those feelings, but those feelings do cause her some difficulty. She is the kind of person the test would suggest where she can become excited. When she does become excited, she may not use the appropriate or good judgment as she otherwise might. Mr. Richards, on the other hand, has another kind of problem in dealing with those types of feelings, and that he tries to avoid those feelings. Again, he is capable of being sensitive to those feelings, but in his ordinary, everyday world, does not pay attention or make use of those feelings. So we see the difference here. We see, on the one hand, Miss Richards, somewhat labile, and slightly, again, I'm talking about subtleties, and I want to make sure of that as clear as I can, but subtly, somewhat labile and emotionally unstable.
Your Honor, the interpreters are unfamiliar with the term labile.
Okay. Dr. Marshall, can you please give a little bit more detailed description of the term labile? Maybe use lay people words?
Yes, I can. That is a word of jargon. I suppose that we fall into using occasionally as psychologists. It means a person whose emotions are likely to go up and down, who there will be some teeter-tottering effect, if you will, to the way they express their feelings. And the person who may be subject to some mood shifts and mood swings, although in this case, not extreme, but likely to have stronger feelings of both positive nature and a negative nature, and swinging back and forth between those feelings.
What was the next test that you administered?
The next test I administered was the thematic apperception test. The thematic apperception test is a series of cards on which photographs depicting a variety of scenes, and the person is asked to tell stories to those cards. What one is looking for here are themes, major themes in one's life, how they deal with achievement-oriented situations, relationships with other people, how they deal with certain kinds of situations where there may be stress or depression. The picture
Hold
I've
on
been
one moment for the interpretation. Thank you. Thank you.
The picture I've been describing with regard to the Richards sort of continues on the thematic apperception test.
I'm sorry, will you rephrase that for the interpreters?
The picture I've been describing, major themes in one's life, how they deal with achievement-oriented situations, relationships with other people, how they deal with certain kinds of situations where there may be stress or depression. And so the picture I've been describing with regard to the Richards sort of continues on the thematic apperception test. And one sees here with Mr. Richard rather a highly achievement-oriented, very goal-oriented or directed, kind of tough-minded person who will adhere to rather rigid, structured approach.
Hold on one moment. The interpreters need to clarify.
Okay.
On where you talk about the picture that we are talking about with the Richards,
Yes.
interpreters are unclear as to the meaning. Do you mean in relation to the previous tests?
Yes, that is correct. I'm talking about themes in particular. And so some of the themes that are occurring here are showing up as well in this battery.
Hold on one moment to finish the interpretation. Could you start from what your findings of Mr. Richards?
Yes. So as I was saying, one sees here with Mr. Richards a rather highly achievement-oriented, a very goal-directed, kind of tough-minded person who will adhere to rather rigid, structured approach to life situations. With Ms. Richards, we see a great deal more flexibility, less of a need to achieve at a high level. Not that she doesn't want to achieve, but less concerned about that and more flexible in terms of standards and expectations from other people.
Were there any other tests that you administered?
Yes, there were. This was a very complete psychological evaluation. I administered a test called the word association test. This is a series of words, 60 of them, and they're read to the patient. The patient is then asked to say the very first word phrase that comes to mind following this stimulus word that has been read to them. This is the test that is used to determine whether or not there are any associative thought disturbance present in an individual. There were no major indications for either of the parties with regard to this test.
Now, does that conclude the tests that you administered to these parties?
No, it does not. There were several others that I had administered. I administered a test called the concept sorting test, a test where persons are asked to sort ordinary and unusual objects found in their environment. And again, there were no major differences with regard to these factors, those factors between these two individuals. They are both intelligent and able to handle ordinary abstract conceptualizations necessary for everyday living. I also administered the MMPI, or the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, which is a long paper and pencil examination. It's really self-administered. A person is instructed as to how to go ahead and take the test. There are a series of 566 true-false questions. They relate to tastes, attitudes, preferences, that sort of thing. The test may be machine scored. I don't. We hand score it, and a personality profile is derived from this test. With regard to the Richards, none of the clinical scales that are found on this test were in the pathological range. The validity scales were all within the normal range as well. The test does again suggest that Miss Richards may be the kind of person who deals with or who has some difficulty dealing with feelings and may have some self-doubt about her own womanliness. On the other hand, Mr. Richards' profile suggests again a person who does not manage feelings very well, and some indications that he tends to puff himself up as a man as a way of protecting himself from having to manage more tender and softer, nurturing kinds of feelings.
How many tests altogether did you give these parties?
Well, I didn't count, but I believe it's 9 or 10.
Now, in a situation where a psychiatrist refers parties to you in a custody dispute, the child also, do you generally give this same battery of tests?
Generally speaking, I do. I use this battery regularly and routinely, and it is the standard testing procedure that I have people go through for such examinations. Naturally, some modification for verbal skills was called for here.
And is it a standard testing procedure that other mental health professionals, such as yourself, also use?
Yes, these are commonly used tests. I would not want to say that all psychologists use all of these tests. I do so because I really do not depend on any single test to arrive at a personality appraisal, or in some cases, a diagnostic appraisal, where it's appropriate. But I use the totality of all the tests to reach those conclusions, and not any specific response to one test or any findings from only one test.
But using the tests as an interrelated battery of tests, you're then able at a given time to come up with very particular kinds of testimony. Is that so? If it were so warranted as a result of the tests?
Well, I do the test now, not to produce any particular kind of testimony, but to understand the personalities of the parties, of the patient that I'm working with, and whether or not there are any degrees of psychopathology that need to be discovered or worked with.
And you did the same battery of tests with the child?
Well, no, I did a more abbreviated battery with the child. With the child, I did exactly the same, but I did the following. I used the draw a picture test. It is called a draw a person test. I used the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children revised. I used the Bender Gestalt, the Rorschach test, the Children's Apperception test, which is the child's version of the thematic apperception test. I also used the concept sorting test. And then I saw the child for what I would call diagnostic play interviews in our playroom. The tests that I have already described are essentially the same tests.
Okay, because of time problem at this moment, without going into each test individually, what was the result? What was your conclusion after having tested the child with all this variety of tests?
Well, I didn't find anything major. The little girl's eye problem, whatever that may have been, did not seem to affect any of the tests that I was able to complete with her. She didn't show any eye-hand kinds of difficulties. She was extremely cooperative, extremely articulate. She showed some proclivity for artistic ability. I found nothing wrong with Sarah in my examination.
Doctor, you've testified to one test that you administered to the child that you had not administered to the parents. Could you please describe that test in a bit more detail for the court?
Yes, I can. The diagnostic play interviews, I indicated during the testing I talked through an interpreter with the adults, with the parents. With the child, I take her into a playroom setting where I have a variety of different kinds of toys and let her play rather spontaneously and freely, choosing the kinds of toys she wants to play with and doing the things that she wants to do. We have a sandbox, paints and trains and cars and dolls and play theater and things of that sort, just to see what the child would do in a more spontaneous situation. And the child did play the appropriate activities for girls that would be expected. There was nothing unusual about that.
Now, was she in the room alone or together with you?
She was alone with me.
Just you and one child in the room?
Yes, that is correct.
And for about what period of time would that kind of test take?
Well, the child was seen on two different occasions, the 22nd and the 23rd. On each of these days, I let her spend some time in the playroom setting with me.
And how much time did you spend altogether with the two adults?
The testing procedures with each of the adults takes about 5 hours.
And after you completed your examinations and tests, you prepared this report?
Yes, I did.
And then you forwarded this report to the psychiatrist who had referred to the people to you in the first place, Dr. Melanie Bishop.
Yes, I did.
Thank you. Judge, I have no further questions of this witness.
Okay. Cross-examination by Ms. Brown? Go right ahead.
Dr. Marshall, did you make any independent investigations in this case? In other words, did you talk to any of the child's teachers or doctors?
I did not.
You didn't. Do you know for a fact which statements were made to you that are true and which ones are false?
By which parties? Do you mean the child or the adults?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
Sure. I was just wondering, do you know for a fact which statements that were made to you were true and which were not true?
By which parties do you mean? The child or the adults?
Both the child and the adults.
Well, my impression is based on the overall examination, that my findings are both valid and reliable. There were no indications on any of the testing done with either the adults or the child, that there was any effort to taint or to mislead me in any way. Clearly, the parents were both putting their best foot forward. It's kind of expected. We talk about that, and I told them that I knew they would be doing that, and it seemed to take some of the heat out of the situation.
1 second.
Doctor, have you done psychological evaluations for Ms. Richards' attorney before this one?
Yes, I have, from time to time.
Okay, now you indicate that you performed the Bender-Gestalt test on Mr. and Mrs. Richards. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
And you indicated Sure. Now, you indicated that you performed the Bender Gestalt test on Mr. and Miss Richards. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
And you indicated there were some memory problems that showed up on that test, I believe with Miss Richards. Is that correct?
I don't think that I would be able to reach that conclusion based on her overall performance at that time. No.
Would it be possible to conclude that Miss Richards was under a chemical dependence, like alcohol, that caused the memory problems?
No.
1 second, hold on, please.
Sure.
We're going a little bit fast, and we're behind about a question
Oh,
and
sorry
behind
about
about a
that.
response. So could we go back to the last question about Miss Richards?
That's fine. Why don't we go ahead and do that if you can, Ms. Brown? And
Sure.
if you will, and I'll try to watch myself as well, if you will just try to slow down
Sure.
your
Sure.
questions.
Sorry about that. Should we back up to the memory problems regarding Miss Richards? Is that correct? Is that where we?
Yes, that's the right question.
Okay, so you indicated there were some memory problems with Miss Richards. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
Would it be possible to conclude that Miss Richards was under a chemical dependence, maybe like alcohol, that caused these memory problems?
I don't think it would be possible for me to reach that conclusion based on her overall performance. No.
You also indicated on at least 4 occasions that she was what you called labile.
Yes, I did.
1 second. Go ahead.
And you said it meant swings in emotions, that she's excitable.
Yes.
Again, could that be caused by possible chemical dependence like alcohol?
It could be. I think I was actually trying to describe what would be a personality characteristic of hers rather than something that was influenced by some chemicals.
1 second.
Certainly, chemicals can or would have an influence on that type of personality style. But I don't think at the time of the examination, in my judgment, she didn't appear to be under the influence of any chemicals.
So you didn't smell alcohol in her breath.
Not only did I not smell alcohol on her, but her overall demeanor, psychomotor capabilities, body movements, eye movements did not indicate that she was under the influence of any chemicals.
One second.
And you performed a thematic apperception test, which you called the TAT on Miss Richards. Is that correct?
Yes, I did.
And
1 second.
sorry.
Go ahead.
And I believe you said that she was not overly concerned with achievement. Is that correct?
Well, I was making a relative statement. She was less concerned with achievement and achievement orientation than her husband.
1 second.
All right, now we're talking today about the custody of a minor child. The fact that Ms. Richards is less achievement-oriented than her husband could possibly lead to the conclusion that that could be transmitted to the child and that the child would be an underachiever as opposed to being with her father. Is that correct?
Well, at the present moment, Sarah seems to be, in my judgment, an achiever. And I did not mean to indicate that Ms. Richards was an underachiever, only that she was not as motivated in that direction as her husband.
To what degree of psychological certainty did you reach your conclusions?
Based on the totality of this evaluation, this examination,
Excuse me,
I would
could you
say...
repeat the question one more time?
Sure. To what degree of psychological certainty did you reach your conclusions?
Based on the totality of this examination, I would be 90%, maybe 95% certain in this case.
1 second.
Are these tests reliable? Are they valid?
In my judgment, they are reliable and valid. That is to say, they measure what they are intended to measure, and they do so in such a way that measures are repeatable.
Well, let me ask this. Can people lie on these tests?
1 second.
Can they taint or bias their answers? Let's take the MMPI to begin with. Is there any way you can determine whether people are lying in their answers on that test?
On the MMPI, yes, you
1
can.
second.
So yes, on the MMPI, you can. However, there are validity scales built in to the test, and one can make that determination. That was not the case here, and there were no indications of that during this examination.
And what about the other tests?
The other tests really rely on the examiner's judgment, and I look for intra-test accuracy and the consistency, as well as inter-test consistency. For a person to lie
I'm sorry,
throughout...
the interpreter would like you to repeat the part about you rely on the intra.
Yes. The other tests really rely on the examiner's judgment. I look for intra-test accuracy and the consistency, as well as the inter-test consistency. For a person to lie or fabricate throughout the examination would be quite difficult, given the extensiveness of this type of test battery.
Now, you say you performed about 5 hours of testing on the adults. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, how much time did you actually spend interviewing the adults?
Hold on one second.
I suppose within the 5 hours, 2 hours. And it took a little longer than normal because of the interpreting.
Now, you also performed time testing the minor child. Is that correct?
1 second. The interpreter would ask that you repeat that last question, please.
Sure. You also performed, or you also spent time testing the minor child. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And about how much time was spent testing her, and how much of that time was spent in actual interviews with her?
I suppose about an hour and 45 minutes of testing. And then there was time in the playroom, probably another hour, at 20 to 25 minute intervals.
One second.
So are you telling the court that you can come to a conclusion based on testing and then only 45 minutes of interviews with the child? Wouldn't it be better for you to have had hours and hours of time and interviews with these parties?
Well, I suppose there's some truth to that. In the more time that you are able to have, the better. But there's also the factor of diminishing returns, and after you do such an extensive test battery, the additional information that you get is not warranted by the time you had spent. So I think believe that the time I did spend was sufficient, and I do believe I got an accurate picture of the parties and of the child.
In other words, are you telling me that in 1 hour, approximately, 90% of what could be learned would be learned, and after that would be a lot less?
No, I'm not saying that in 1 hour, but I'm saying in the totality of what I've done here, in the course of 16 hours, nearly, that I've learned perhaps 90% of what might be learned.
1 second.
Now, doctor, you're not a sign language interpreter, are you?
No, I am not.
Do you sign at all?
Only very little, a few signs.
1 second.
You're not a sign language expert or an expert in the communication skills of deaf people, are you?
No, by no means.
I have no further questions at this time.
All right. Any redirect, Ms. Smith?
No, thank you, Judge.
Okay. Thank you, doctor. You may step down. right, Ms. Smith, does that conclude your case at this point?
I have no further witnesses, Judge. Thank you.
All right. Ms. Brown, who do you intend to call next?
Your Honor, I would like to call Mr. Philip Richards, the respondent.
All right, we
The
will
court-
call Mr. Richard, oh, I'm sorry, go right ahead.
I'm sorry. The court should know that we have interpreters present to interpret for him.
Okay, we'll go ahead and call Mr. Richards next.